As an attorney, I spend my days dealing with paper trails, financial disclosures, and the meticulous process of uncovering the truth. For years, my wife Jill and I have been systematically dismantling the absolute financial stronghold her father, Jim Bob Duggar, built over his 19 children. But even with all my legal training and all the things I already knew he was capable of, nothing could have prepared me for the phone call I received at 20:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The caller didn't say hello. It was a panicked whisper from one of the younger Duggar boys, still trapped inside the Tontitown compound. "Derek," he choked out, "they're here. The driveway is full of them." I sat straight up in bed. "Who is here?" I asked, my blood turning to ice. The line went silent for a terrifying second before he answered. "The police. SWAT. They are breaking down the doors to Dad's office. I'm Derek Dillard. Over the next hour, I am going to take you inside the most secretive, heavily guarded compound in Arkansas and detail the exact timeline of the midnight raid that brought the Duggar empire to its knees. Because the truth about what the FBI found inside the big house is worse than anyone ever imagined. For the last 3 years, Jill and I have been engaged in a brutal $10 million inheritance war with my father-in-law. When we first filed the lawsuit, the public thought it was just a family squabble over reality television paychecks. But once the discovery phase of the litigation began, the sheer volume of documents my legal team subpoenaed started painting a much darker picture. We weren't just looking at unpaid wages, we were looking at a labyrinth of LLCs, shell corporations, and offshore trusts designed to hide millions of dollars from the IRS and, more importantly, from the children who actually earned it. Jim Bob operated under the assumption that his religious authority made him untouchable. He believed that because he commanded absolute obedience within the four walls of his church and his home, the federal government would simply look the other way. But arrogance is always a criminal's greatest liability. Every time he refused to turn over a document, every time he tried to intimidate a witness, he wasn't just stalling our civil case, he was unknowingly building a criminal one against himself. The weeks leading up to the raid were intensely paranoid inside the Duggar compound. The younger kids who had managed to escape, like Jinger, Justin, and eventually Johanna and Jennifer, had started sharing information with us. They told us about the late night meetings Jim Bob was having with his personal accountants. They described seeing him frantically shredding documents in his home office, an office that no one, not even Michelle, was allowed to enter without his explicit permission. The PR machine was in absolute overdrive, pushing out distraction after distraction. Every day there was a new pregnancy announcement from one of the older loyal brothers, or a perfectly staged family photo ops on Instagram. It was a desperate attempt to project stability while the foundation was visibly cracking. But the federal authorities don't care about Instagram aesthetics. They care about wire fraud, tax evasion, and the systemic financial exploitation of minors. When the raid actually happened, it wasn't a polite knock on the door during business hours. It was a calculated, overwhelming show of force designed to prevent the destruction of evidence. At exactly 2:00 a.m., a convoy of unmarked black SUVs and local police cruisers turned off the highway and sped down the long, winding driveway toward the big house. They didn't wait for Jim Bob to come to the door in his pajamas. They breached the perimeter. According to the panicked phone call I received from my brother-in-law, the sheer noise of the raid woke the entire house. Flashlights cut through the darkness of the compound, and armed agents swarmed the property. For a family that had spent their entire lives terrified of the outside world, having the federal government literally kick down their doors was the ultimate nightmare realized. The absolute control Jim Bob had maintained for decades evaporated in a matter of seconds. The agents had very specific search warrants. They didn't waste time searching the massive industrial kitchen or the girls' dormitory. They went straight for the nerve centers of the Duggar empire. They swarmed Jim Bob's private home office, the separate building that housed his real estate and car lot operations, and the massive server room where he kept digital backups of all family communications and financial transactions. My brother-in-law described watching from a second-story window as agents carried out box after box of physical files, computer hard drives, and ledgers. They were taking everything. The very documents Jim Bob had spent years hiding from Jill, from the public, and from the government were suddenly being loaded into the back of an FBI truck in the pouring rain. And right in the middle of the chaos, standing on the front lawn in the glare of the police spotlights, was the patriarch himself. The visual my brother in law painted for me that night was something straight out of a movie. Jim Bob Duggar, a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling the narrative, dictating modesty rules to his daughters, and demanding absolute financial submission from his sons, was standing on his perfectly manicured lawn, surrounded by federal agents. He wasn't wearing his usual crisp polo shirt. He was in a bathrobe, completely disheveled, and for the first time in his life, he looked small. He was arguing with the officers, waving his arms, trying to invoke his status in the community, his political connections, anything to stop the inevitable. But federal warrants don't negotiate. The agents ignored his protests and continued systematically stripping his empire of its secrets. Michelle was reportedly standing on the porch, clutching her robe, watching the physical manifestation of her husband's deceit being boxed up and driven away. The sheer silence of the remaining children in the house was deafening. They were terrified. As an attorney, I knew the immediate priority wasn't just watching the raid unfold. It was protecting the younger siblings who were still trapped in the crossfire. While I was on the phone, I could hear the sheer panic in the background. The older loyal brothers, the ones heavily involved in Jim Bob's real estate businesses, were scrambling. They were making hushed phone calls to their own lawyers, terrified that the financial entanglement they had agreed to in exchange for housing and income was about to pull them under too. The house was a chaotic mix of law enforcement, shouting orders, and family members terrified to speak to each other. Jill woke up and sat next to me on the edge of our bed, listened to the nightmare unfold on speakerphone. She didn't cry. After years of fighting him in civil court and watching him manipulate the truth, there was only a profound sense of validation. The monster wasn't invincible anymore. By sunrise, the scene at the Tontitown compound was no longer a secret. The flashing lights had attracted the attention of neighbors, and within an hour, local news vans were parked at the end of the long driveway, cameras pointed squarely at the big house. The Duggar PR machine, usually so swift to spin a narrative or announce a new pregnancy to distract the public, was completely paralyzed. They couldn't issue a statement about God's plan when the FBI was actively carrying out hard drives. The internet exploded. Twitter and Reddit were flooded with blurry cell phone pictures of the police cruisers, and speculation ran wild. Was it related to the civil lawsuit Jill and I filed? Was it massive tax fraud? Or had they found something even darker connected to the businesses that funded their reality television lifestyle? The family's silence only fueled the fire. Later that morning, the true scope of the raid became clear to me when I received a call from my own legal counsel handling the $10 million inheritance lawsuit. The federal investigation wasn't just a separate issue. It was directly intersecting with our civil case. The documents we had been fighting Jim Bob for years to produce, the very documents he claimed didn't exist or were protected by religious privilege, were the exact same documents the authorities were seizing. It turns out you can't build an empire on the unpaid labor of your children, funnel that money into complex shell companies to avoid paying them, and simultaneously expect the IRS and the federal government not to notice the massive discrepancies in your financial disclosures. Jim Bob's greed had finally overridden his caution. He thought he was smarter than the system. He was dead wrong. The hardest part of the next 48 hours was watching the collateral damage within the family. While Jill, Jinger, and the other siblings who had escaped were safely removed from the immediate danger, the ones still living in Arkansas were completely isolated. Jim Bob immediately ordered a total media blackout for anyone still on his payroll. He confiscated cell phones from the younger girls who hadn't managed to leave yet. Terrified they would leak information or talk to the authorities, he gathered the older boys and demanded absolute loyalty, trying to convince them this was a spiritual attack from the enemy, a test of their faith, but the illusion was broken. The older boys, specifically the ones with growing families of their own, were suddenly looking at their father not as a spiritual leader, but as a massive liability. They realized that their homes, their businesses, and their futures were entirely tied to a man who was now the subject of a massive federal investigation. As the dust settled over the compound and the news vans eventually backed away from the gates, the real legal bloodbath began. In the days following the raid, my phone didn't stop ringing. Through back channels and legal connections, the picture of what the FBI had actually confiscated started to take shape. They didn't just take a few missing tax returns, they took the master blueprint of the Duggar family's financial deception. We are talking about dozens of LLCs created under the names of various children, used to funnel reality TV money, real estate profits, and speaking engagement fees into accounts controlled entirely by Jim Bob. As an attorney, I have seen complex fraud cases, but the sheer audacity of doing this to your own flesh and blood, all while preaching about biblical family values on national television, is a level of hypocrisy that still makes my blood boil. The tragedy of Jim Bob's empire is how he weaponized his own sons to build it. Within a week of the raid, the older boys, the ones who had stayed loyal, the ones who had participated in the endless PR baby boom to distract the public, began to realize the terrifying legal jeopardy they were in. When you sign paperwork for an LLC because your father tells you it is God's will for the family business, you don't realize you are making yourself a co-conspirator in a federal tax evasion scheme. Several of my brothers in law quietly started retaining their own. Independent criminal defense attorneys, for the first time in their lives, they were forced to seek counsel outside of the Duggar umbrella. The blind loyalty that Jim Bob had demanded from them was suddenly turning into the very thing that could send them to federal prison. The big, happy, unified family facade was actively destroying itself from the inside out. You would think that a midnight raid by federal agents would inspire some level of humility or repentance. But Jim Bob only knows one playbook to spin. About 2 weeks after the raid, his PR team attempted a desperate Hail Mary defense. They leaked a statement to a friendly conservative media outlet trying to frame the FBI raid as an act of religious persecution against a devout Christian family. He tried to claim that the government was targeting him because of his traditional beliefs. It was the exact same gaslighting technique he had used on Jill and me when we first asked for an accounting of our own wages. The public wasn't buying it anymore. You don't get raided by SWAT teams at 2 a.m. because you hold conservative family values. You get raided because you commit wire fraud. The internet tore the statement apart, and the backlash was so severe that the family had to completely disable comments on every single one of their social media platforms. Then there's the Michelle factor. Throughout all of the scandals, from my older brother-in-law's horrific crimes to our civil lawsuit, Michelle Duggar had always played the role of the quiet, submissive wife. She was shielded by the patriarchal structure of the Institute in basic life principles, the cult they raised their children in. The doctrine teaches that a wife is simply under the umbrella of authority of her husband and is not responsible for his decisions. But the federal government does not recognize the IBLP umbrella. The IRS only recognizes signatures on joint tax returns. When the authorities started digging through the financial documents, it became glaringly obvious that Michelle's signature was on years of potentially fraudulent filings. Sitting in my office, reading the legal analysis of their exposure, I realized that the matriarch of the Duggar family was no longer just an innocent bystander. She was legally tethered to a sinking ship. The absolute turning point in this entire saga came exactly 3 weeks after the raid. I was sitting at my desk when I received an encrypted email from a source closely connected to the investigation. It wasn't just a rumor, it was a confirmation. The United States Attorney's Office was officially convening a federal grand jury. Subpoenas were being drafted not just for the accountants and the business partners, but for the Duggar children themselves, the siblings who had been forced to work for free, the ones whose names had been forged on contracts, and the ones who had escaped to build their own lives were about to be called to testify under oath against their own father. The $10 million Civil War Jill and I had finally triggered the ultimate criminal reckoning. Jim Bob Duggar wasn't just facing a lawsuit anymore. He was facing handcuffs. The day the grand jury subpoena started arriving at the doorsteps of the Duggar children was the day the silence finally broke. In our world, the ultimate sin is dishonoring your father. Jim Bob had used that religious weapon for decades to keep his children from questioning his finances or his authority. but a federal subpoena doesn't care about your family hierarchy. It is a legal command to tell the truth under the penalty of perjury. I watched my brothers-in-law, men who had spent their entire lives under Jim Bob's thumb, realize they were being forced into an impossible choice, lie for their father and risk a prison sentence, or tell the truth and be cast out of the family forever. The family group chats, once filled with Bible verses and baby updates, went completely dark. The fear was no longer about disappointing Dad. It was about the federal government. The internal collapse of the Loyalist brothers was the most painful part to witness. Jedediah, Jeremiah, and the others who had built their entire financial lives on Jim Bob's real estate deals found themselves in a terrifying legal limbo. When the FBI seized the servers, they didn't just find Jim Bob's secrets. They found the paper trails of every son who had signed off on a questionable property flip or a shell company tax filing. The every man for himself mentality began to set in. We started hearing whispers of brothers seeking immunity deals, offering to testify about the big house operations in exchange for protecting their own young families. The empire wasn't just being attacked from the outside, it was cannibalizing itself from within. The loyalty that Jim Bob had bought with houses and cars was worth nothing when faced with a decade in a federal penitentiary. The big house, once the bustling, chaotic center of a media dynasty, has become a literal ghost town in 2026 after the raid and the subsequent freezing of the family's main assets. The staff fled. The film crews are long gone. The industrial kitchen, which used to feed 19 children and a revolving door of guests, is silent. Jill and I drove past the gates recently, and it was unrecognizable. The grass was overgrown, the windows were dark, and the sense of power that used to radiate from that property had completely vanished. It's no longer a compound. It's a monument to greed and the high cost of secrets. Jim Bob is reportedly living in a state of total isolation, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and a shrinking circle of advisors who are only staying as long as the remaining money holds out. The patriarch who wanted to build a 1,000-year dynasty is watching his kingdom turn to dust before his eyes. The final legal reckoning came in the form of a massive federal indictment. The charges were staggering: multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and a systematic pattern of financial exploitation that spanned over 2 decades. As an attorney, seeing those charges in black and white was the culmination of years of work. But as a husband, seeing the look on Jill's face was the real victory. This was never about the $10 million for us. It was about the truth. It was about ensuring that no other child in that family would ever be treated like a commodity again. The 2026 trial isn't just about Jim Bob Duggar. It's a trial of a system that allowed a man to use religion as a shield for a criminal enterprise. The world is finally seeing what we saw behind the scenes, that the perfect family was actually a perfectly managed fraud. As I look at my wife and our children, I realize that the greatest thing we ever gave them wasn't an inheritance or a reality TV legacy. It was the truth. We taught them that no authority is above the law and no family secret is worth your soul. The Duggar name used to stand for a brand, a television show, and a specific type of religious performance. Today, it stands as a warning. It is a warning about what happens when you build a house on a foundation of lies and exploitation. The midnight raid was the beginning of the end, but for the siblings who escaped, it was the beginning of a new, honest life. The empire has fallen, the big house is empty, and the silence is finally over. My name is Derek Dillard, and the truth has finally come home.